So let's get back into the Griffin text, and we're looking now at chapter 1. So if we've gone through the introduction, see the previous videos. If you want to see what Griffin gives in his introduction, which is basically an overview, a survol of this work. Remember, it's the Griffin book on human rights. And so now we're into chapter 1. And in this video, we're going to start with section 1.1. There's 6 sections in this opening chapter, and he covers a lot of ground. So let's see just what Griffin is up to. So in chapter 1, he's talking about HR, human rights, the incomplete idea. So we're going to go over some ground that we've seen in the previous videos, namely what Griffin talks about in the introduction. And there was, I think McIntyre really started this, like the Enlightenment Project. We hear a lot about that. So what's the Enlightenment Project on human rights? Okay, that's the section, that's the topic for section 1.1. Now, there's no single, like in notion of human rights during the Enlightenment, which is just E for Enlightenment. So you don't want to think that, oh, everybody in the Enlightenment was just all focused on one thing. And there's a tendency when we talk about historical events or eras or whatever to say, oh yeah, everybody was doing this or that. No, we're talking more about during the Enlightenment. It was quite a common theme to talk, to at least start talking about human rights and to talk about them in a way which differed from the way the medievals would talk about rights, namely in the context of a natural right, which had a huge metaphysical background to it. So the metaphysics is basically being disengaged from the concept, right? So you could start talking about humans in a non-metaphysical way, right? You talk about humans in a metaphysical way, you're talking about souls, you're talking about, created in the image of God, right? So it's not just a physical entity. To talk about the world in a metaphysical way, you're saying that there is something that the world relates to that is not just empirical. So this secularization is an important one. Some thinkers, though, just didn't want anything to do with this sort of rights and stuff. So we're not worried about those. But what was this main theme? As I put a little asterisk, I'll refer back to it. So it's this ongoing secularization, this draining out of the metaphysics, but not to the point where it's an utter rejection of it, because there were exceptions, right? And John Locke is pretty important thinker of the time. He's an empiricist, and some people often think he's more empirically minded than he actually is. I mean, so be careful with when you say, oh, he's an empiricist, because, empiricists we normally think of as, being very tied to sense perception and what comes in through the senses. And if something doesn't come in through the senses, well, then, the empiricists can't talk about it, or might even take a stronger line that if it doesn't come in through the senses, it's not even worthy of deeming real, or it's a fiction, or maybe it's even nonsense. Locke certainly wasn't that strong of an empiricist. Locke, did root some of his ideas in politics in a metaphysical structure. As a matter of fact, much of Locke's work does tie back to metaphysics. But just as a quick little example, so an exception to this secularization of the idea of human rights would be Locke, who linked his principle of equality with the existence of God. So he's got a fair amount of Christianity, Christian notions built into his political theory, his epistemology, and all his stuff. There's God stuff throughout a lot of it, but that's a topic for another time. The important point is that while there is the secularization, there are notable exceptions to that trend. The point maybe that helps to elucidate this rough idea of the secularization of the idea of human rights is that really it's being disengaged. The concept of a human right is being disengaged from any particular metaphysics. So in other words, it's kind of like becoming like a free variable or a free agent, right? In that sense that you could be interested in human rights and have a certain metaphysics that you want to bring in, or maybe you don't have any metaphysics, or you have a different kind of metaphysics. right? People often would have different backgrounds or different metaphysical contexts, or not at all, and still working towards the same concept. So that's the real idea that's going on historically, is that it's being disengaged from any particular metaphysics, not necessarily being hostile to metaphysics per se, but not really relying on it. Hugo Grotius kind of exemplifies this view, where he says things like, well, the law and all this stuff will work without the existence of God. You don't need a metaphysical structure. But then he quickly says, but I would never entertain what he calls, quote unquote, the wicked hypothesis that God doesn't exist. He still thinks that God exists and all that, but it's not necessary for the argument. So that's kind of where we're going with that one in this historical sense. Yet, even many of the thinkers that wanted to disengage the secularized concept, or well, that wanted to disengage the concept, in other words, secularize it, they still, human rights were still stronger than mere conventions, right? Just mere sorts of things that we, positive law, things that we just pass in parliaments or emperors declare or whatever, that's just simply asserted, right? Or just things we cook up or imagine. People still didn't want to put human rights on that level, that there's something stronger to the notion of it, without necessarily embedding it, deep in the camp of metaphysics. All right. And Griffin points out that kind of hand-waving approach to the strength of the background of human rights can be found today. And he points out that if you listen to lawyers, and lots of people talk like this, that there is a sense of, natural justice, that justice is, maybe a lot of people would be like, well, I'm not comfortable with necessarily running and talking about God right away or anything like that. But really, when we talk about justice, we're talking about something stronger than just conventions. Now, note that this is a negative sort of account of the context of a human right or justice, by saying, well, it's not just a convention, okay, and it's not necessarily consequent upon assuming some grandiose metaphysical system. Okay, so it's not that. Need there be another thing? So it's not that, not. Well, what is it? So you can give these negative definitions, and theologians, they tend to love those, like negative definitions. God is not. But we also find that psychologically, arguably, and philosophically as well, somewhat unsatisfactory. That is, we want a positive definition. Well, you've told me what natural justice isn't. What is it? Well, you're not really going to get, much more than, a repetition of, well, it's not law books, or it's not, well, what is it? Still, you're not going to get a very good answer there if you get one at all. Now, okay, so we've got this notion of a secularization, this disengagement from metaphysics, but not, hostility to metaphysics, but shall we say a much more open, kind of compatible, and a lot of concepts, when they're nice and open, right, and they can work well with a lot of other concepts. Usually they don't have a lot of content, because concepts that have a big intention, if you don't remember what that means, go back and look at the earlier videos. Lots of concepts that have a big intention, lots of meaning, they're very determinate, right? So they don't work with just any old concept that comes along, right? So, if you think about certain kinds of concepts, like animal is a much more open concept than cat, right? So, if you want to work with a concept, it's easier to work with the concept of animal than it is to work with the concept of cat, because if you want to be talking about cats, they're more specialized than the concept of animals. So that would lead into also their extension is more determinate. So by having this secularization, you get this indeterminateness, right? And not that determinateness is always great, because, a lot of things are done in the name of determinateness, which can be very, 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 very bad for human rights as well. But in any case, the developments that Griffin talks about, in addition to the secularization of the idea of human rights, are there's two of them, right? One is the first one is that writers would aim at writing up these lists of rights, and we see that today, right? Yeah, there's always lists of rights, and when people talk about human rights, they often say, "Well, it's this, this, and this, and this." The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights is a big list of those things as well, and that's all well, fine, and good, and that can be helpful. And Griffin says that is helpful. So you have big lists that are drawn up. You think about the late 1700s. So the late 1700s, you get the French and American. They're big lists, right? We don't call them big lists. Basically, you get the French with their 1789, their Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then the Bill of Rights in the American Revolution a couple years after that. So around 1789 and about 1792-ish. Yeah, something like that, 1792 for the Bill of Rights. So the Declaration and then the American Bill of Rights. And these weren't just lists, these weren't just laundry lists, right? They were important. Well, laundry lists are important too, I guess. These were important lists. They were these big lists. They were important. They played a role. They were part of, shall we say, like a political force. They were part of a political force. They were helping to shape the society. So human rights became a popular, shall we say, like a popular mode of discourse. People started talking about them, and Griffin points out, that people use these, right, as asserting rights and human rights, and violating them was a way that you could legitimate political dissent, right? It was like, well, you violated. Why are you angry and rebelling against the government? Well, my human rights were violated. Oh, okay. And thank you, big list. You provided this justification. So it made people more aware of things that they could argue are legitimate means for reacting to the authorities, and means of controlling authorities as well, and giving people more guidelines on how they were to behave and stay out of trouble as well. And when they got into trouble, they sometimes appealed to these. So they are an important political force. And this is going to come up quite a bit in Griffin's work, because he does talk about, certain things that are they're with us. They played an important part in history. So we're not going to just toss them out, even if philosophically we find something to complain about. But at the end of it all, we still get this notion of a human right that we largely inherit, this thinned out version of it, namely that X, X is a subject, or, we're talking about human, right? Because it has a human right. So X is a variable that is limited to the set of human beings. So X is a human right in virtue of being human. So we've talked about this a little bit in the introduction. What does that mean? So this idea of being human. I mean, for instance, Locke was concerned when he talked about personal identity. So just to give you an idea, the notion of what is a human, right? That's an old one. You've probably heard the expression about like a man is, well, if we updated, a human being is a rational animal, right? And so, okay, well, that gives you a little bit. It's not just merely being an animal. It's being a special kind of animal, namely rationality. So the essence, or the key characteristic, may not be the only one, but the most important characteristic is being rational, right? A rational animal. Yeah, that's what we mean by a human being. But is this really clear in terms of what's come out of the Enlightenment Project? Griffin says no. So we got to keep going, and we got to keep looking at this concept. So nature of being human, because that's going to be the key to how Griffin is going to understand eventually. We've got a ways to go, but eventually a more determinate concept of human rights. See you next video.